Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Gameweek 12 draft wildcard. This is for people who are planning to wildcard in Gameweek 12, noticeably because there are some pretty huge swings on this game week, with City's fixtures now looking really poor, as they have been really, I think, for the last 2 game weeks as well. But more importantly, positive swings in the direction of Newcastle and Arsenal, and even arguably still a little bit left of what is a nice United swing before their fixtures sort of roughen up between 14 and 16. But there are some picks that I think are very, very solid and will stand the test of the Game Week 12 draft for any situation, but there's a little bit of uncertainty right now. And I think one of the chief ones is clearly all these international break injuries. Do they have any sort of sustenance? And before we jump into the draft itself, I'd like to just talk about that sort of concept, right? We dealt with this exact situation a couple weeks ago when Saka was prospectively going to play versus Bournemouth, with all the news from, let's say, Arteta or Lee Carsley talking about how he actually didn't have a very serious injury and he ended up not playing. So I do think that, yes, international break injuries are mostly just that, international break injuries, but we do know that the fixture calendar for the Premier League players has become extremely tough around this period, and they're only about to get into a tougher run of games. So one thing that you sort of have to keep in mind with is if you go thinner on the draft, which I think is plausible, ultimately, if you have less cash in the bank than other players, you're going to have to go thinner regardless. But the thinner you go in your draft, the more it will probably suffer over this period where people will rotate, people will play Champions League games, and bigger teams who actually have a little bit more depth in place might be able to accommodate for that a bit better, things like that. So that's just something I would actually put into concept here. I'm not saying you need to have 8 attackers in a draft. I'm also not saying that you need to have 5 defenders, but I would like a draft really on a Game Week 12 wildcard, seeing the really packed December and January run ahead, to keep that in mind and to at least have one or the other. And that's probably where I sit in terms of drafts. And I still like rotating players. I've enjoyed a lot of Rodgers bench points this season, but that's not going to stop me from rotating players and trying to optimize around fixtures. It has worked out for me before. I still think it'll work out for me over the course of the season. And that's sort of conceptually how I like to draft my teams. Now, if we start with defense, as I said, the most important team to probably look at here is Arsenal, right? Arsenal is a team that we've held in extremely high regard over the last year and a half. Clearly, they have suffered a bit of downturn in form, and I think, admittedly, Liverpool have also improved a lot. And something that I'll be recapping later on in one of the videos that I'll be creating for the international break is this concept of team strengths and how things have moved, how we understand the landscape to have changed, but then also, once again, contextualizing with the fixture run ahead. Arsenal just simply have, in my opinion, the best defensive fixture run ahead, very much like Liverpool had the best run of games starting from game week 1. So from this point of view, I still think that dropping Liverpool defense is fine. Konate does exist, and he is one of the better picks that I think a lot of people can consider. But keep in mind, of course, he does have quite a prevailing injury history. And at the same time, you'd also just argue that doubling up on Arsenal is totally fine in this period from a defensive point of view. You could also want to save that sort of space to get a Martin Odegaard in the team, but I quite like simply having a keeper spot locked. I think we are struggling for good goalkeepers within the Premier League for the Fantasy Premier League element. Seeing that Alisson is still out for now, and probably, there isn't a positive update just yet. I think we initially expected he might come back after this international break, but I haven't seen a positive update there. So it does make sense to me to actually lock in someone like Raya now, particularly when Fabianski is such an easy pairing next to him and already gives you a little bit of goalkeeper rotation ultimately, but then once again, a second alternate goalkeeper, which is great. In the actual defense positions, I would still go with Gabriel, although some people might be minded to wait for a Calafiori to come into the team because he's a lot cheaper and you could potentially save a little bit of money on Gabriel. But to me, Gabriel is still someone with equal or better minutes to, equal minutes to Saliba, not necessarily better minutes to Saliba. We know Saliba is probably the most important player in the team when it comes to minutes over the course of an entire season for Arsenal. But Gabriel has that much more goal threat, where I think the potential loss in minutes with him maybe being involved in Brazilian international duty like he actually missed out in Sheffield United at home last season isn't really enough. I think Gabriel is still the better pick to go with, particularly since the price drops have probably made it easier to move into Gabriel as well. As far as one of the picks that I think a lot of people will have issue with, I think Dunk sits here, and some people will have issues with him. I think Dunk is a super easy replacement. If we get any sort of confirmation that Dunk is out, Anderson from Fulham, I think, is the most simple, logical pick, who is at a cheap price point, who still plays for a solid, what I would call mid-table defense, arguably top half in Fulham. The same, I think, it should really apply to Brighton. So these types of defenders are just rotation pieces. And I think Dunk is totally fine. But if he's not fine, just go for Anderson. As far as a player that I haven't really stand myself over the course of the season, I will sort of pick out Luka Dean. It does seem like he is the preferred player. The only issue I would say is that there are so many fixtures, you might still miss out on some key Luka Dean games. It might be the case that Maatsen will still rotate, just like he does rotate sometimes in the Champions League, and like he did, for example, in the previous match versus Club Brugge. So that is one small caveat, but it does seem like he's played so well this season, and his minutes have been safe enough to say that I don't think you probably run into that risk of the caveat of Dean getting subbed off before 60 minutes as often as it did seem to happen when Alex Moreno was in the team. So that seems like that could be maybe also related to Moreno's previous fitness issues as to why I saw a lot of Dean and Moreno rotation. Maybe now with Dean showing that he's actually capable, he's probably a very strong pick to consider. Now that we also know that there's injuries potentially to Ezri Konsa with his hip and Pau Torres pulling out of international duty. So I guess on the flip side, that might actually be a view to actually not go for an Aston Villa defender, but I do quite like Luka Dean for the attacking sort of quality that he provides. And Hall reminds me of this exact same situation. You know, there are threats of Botman coming in January, of Lloyd Kelly being in the squad and not getting minutes, but ultimately I think Hall has played exceedingly well. He's on both sided corners, and I don't think Trippier is really going to harm the overall minutes when, let's say, players get shifted in and out of the team. I think Hall has been playing well enough to get good minutes over this run, and even though you might have to deal with, I guess, less expected minutes compared to some of the other defenders, I do think that he does preside the flip side of the coin, which is, I guess, that proverbial ceiling when we talk about defenders. And even when it comes to bonus points as well, that is quite important, because when we look at bonus points, it's also about passes completed, things like that. And he also has the additional threat, of course, of the corner set pieces and expected assists from there. So I do really like Lewis Hall. I think he's a bit of a no-brainer. The last pick is going to be Ait Nouri. And once again, this is one of those picks where you have missed, of course, a Southampton at home fixture, but you don't have to play every single defender in this draft every single week. The point is there are good fixtures ahead for this Wolves team. They are not a good defense, but he is clearly a very sort of robust attacker for this team. And when I compare the Wolves run of games compared to the Ipswich run of games, and I make, let's say, a simple comparison of Ait Nouri versus Leif Davis, I do think Ait Nouri simply has better games and better fixtures in his horizon and probably possesses similar attacking threat in open play, because yes, Leif Davis will have sort of set piece threat as well, but I still think that Ait Nouri is positionally allowed to play in very, very interesting spots for this team, and that's a huge plus, and we can see that reflected within his expected goal involvement, which is why I have Ait Nouri within this draft. In the midfield here, one common pick that we've seen a lot for many game weeks is Morgan Rogers. And I still think the question is going to be, is Morgan Rogers better than Semenyo? And ultimately, unless Semenyo is actually confirmed to be injured, even though he sort of pulled out of his international duty, I think Semenyo is the better pick because the horizon is much cleaner for Semenyo, because I still see him as a much better goal threat. Now, Morgan Rogers has actually done incredible work so far in the latest game weeks in FPL, and he still has good fixtures ahead. So I don't think it's necessarily clear cut, but Semenyo just has really good fixtures, really good minutes, and we're seeing less rotation, for example, for someone like Semenyo compared to someone like Morgan Rogers, who can get plucked out at a game at 58 minutes, 65 minutes at any time, because he probably has to manage his load over the Champions League fixtures as well. So that for me is very significant, and that's why I prefer Semenyo ultimately. In the midfield as well, on top of that, I've gone with Bruno, Palmer, Salah, and Saka. The big asterisk is going to be on Saka, because as I said at the start of the video, I don't think every single international break injury that has ever come into existence is fake, right? We've seen this already happen to Saka before. If you're going to miss out on a potential Saka start, I still think it's probably worth considering maybe drafting him in, because if you think he's back for effectively every fixture after that, he's probably still someone that I would hold in a slightly higher regard than players like Son right now, or even Phil Foden, just from a fixtures perspective. And also, once again, that sort of importance, right? He has had a noticeable increase in terms of his underlying stats. The alternative, I suppose, is you also maybe skip this structure here, and the structure core, I would say, is Palmer, Salah, and Saka, right? These are the players you're sort of building your team around. And if you can't afford someone like Saka, I think that's fine. You could still go with someone like Odegaard in the future. The only thing that I would say is that owning both Odegaard and Bruno is a bit weird, because in the future, you'll probably have to use 2 free transfers to maneuver around those spots because no one is at the price point of a Bruno or an Odegaard. So that's something to think about for any manager thinking about doubling up on the two if you have uncertainty over Saka. But for now, I think it's quite easy and quite comfortably a lock to have Saka on the wildcard draft unless we don't get good information. I am someone who owns Son, for example, within my own FPL team, and I am highly considering a Saka move, and that move is probably going to be locked in for me unless we have doubt. And once we have doubt in FPL, that justifies potentially going without a player if you feel like that is tipping the edge, and there's going to be multiple transfers or different transfer paths that you can go for without a Bukayo Saka. So for now, I'm assuming that Saka is fine. I think he should be fine, but I still think it is noticeable and relevant that he got subbed off in a game where they were not in a comfortable position, for example, versus Chelsea. They still had something to fight for, and I see Saka as such a huge downgrade. Same with Declan Rice as well in terms of being subbed off early. There's absolutely no way Arteta would have intentionally had that happen. Saka made the choice himself, and clearly there might be something going on. Bruno is clearly a pick where, yes, game weeks 14 to 16 aren't great for United, but ultimately being able to capitalize on these fixtures here and also have a pivot potentially later down the line as well to some other picks like maybe a Bowen or a Gordon, I think is totally fine. I would try to capitalize on these two good fixtures for Bruno with Ipswich away and Everton at home first, and then think about how you might manage Bruno anyways. Because ultimately, if you're a Bruno owner, game week 15, for example, is a totally good fixture. It's only 14 and 16 that stick out like a sore thumb. As far as Palmer, he is, I would say, close to non-negotiable over this fixture run. He might not be your default captaincy week to week, right? This week, for example, there's the question mark of Salah versus Palmer, and we'll discuss that in a moment. But the reason why I quite like Palmer is because he is just someone who I think is honestly price efficient in this period, even without the captaincies regarded. Just because the fixture run is so good, his minutes outlook still looks so good because of the rotation element that Chelsea have, which honestly affords him this sort of luxury. So I really like Palmer right now, and I think him and Salah are probably the two picks that I find non-negotiable over this run, because the question with Salah is always going to be, who's covering most of your captaincies? Is it between Salah, Palmer, and Saka? And I think ultimately, yes, with the exception of maybe Erling Haaland on game week 14, but that's not that significant of a gap compared to some of the other alternative fixtures you have week to week. So I think by having these three players, you are ultimately covering an insane run of games up until City have a good run again, which will sort of reappear around game week 17/18. I could even argue that holding these three players, you don't really need to even consider Erling Haaland until potentially game week 19, because the way that I see it with captaincies over this fixture run is you can simply look at this game week and start from here. And if we do a sort of simple captaincy matrix with Salah, Palmer, and Saka, I would say this game week is quite easy. A Salah captaincy. Next game week is a Palmer captaincy. The game week after that is a Palmer captaincy. So that's 13 and 14. 15 and 16, I would say, are 15 definitely a Salah captaincy. 16 probably split between all three players. I think they're all great picks on 16. On 17, once again, super close split down the line. I think you can captain anyone. And then on game week 18, I would probably still captain Mo Salah there in that situation, even though Saka himself has an amazing fixture with Ipswich at home. So ultimately, up until that period, I don't think there's any captaincies that do stick out against Erling Haaland's fixtures, except for, as I said, game week 14. I think that's good enough, right? If Haaland is not the best captaincy option for more than 50% of the time, I don't think there's a reason to hold Haaland in the team, and that's why he's not on this sort of wildcard draft. As far as the front line, a lot of questions could be asked about how we approach the budget forwards, and I do think that João Pedro, a 4.5 forward, or if you actually have more money in the bank, simply just going for someone like Strand Larsen, one of the cheapest available options, alongside someone like Liam Delap, who ultimately has a good run of games compared to Liam Delap. That I think is probably the best way to go around this period, because you also have other picks like Evan Nilsson, but that involves spending more money. The same with Raul as well. Those are the only two picks that I would say are actually quite interesting, but Strand Larsen, I think, as a basic pick, if you want to go as cheap as possible while still having a little bit of rotation and cover, is fine. But I think that going simply João Pedro and Isak is great, because Isak is probably someone that you don't bench at all over this fixture run. With João Pedro, you're probably doing something similar, where with you have 5 defenders in place, whenever he, let's say, misses out on a start or potentially gets rested for whatever reason, unbeknownst to us right now, I think that's fine. I would take the punt that João Pedro with limited minutes is still a very, very top tier forward. When I say limited minutes, I'm talking about if he suddenly becomes, let's say, an average of 65 minutes over this fixture run, I still think he's an absolutely elite FPL option. I've held that opinion since Game Week 1, where I obviously owned him in my team. So that's sort of how I see João Pedro. And it doesn't mean that all the other budget forwards that we've been talking about in recent weeks, like a Welbeck, like a Wood, like a Wissa or Raul, are not relevant here. They're still very, very good. But my main point is I still think that you can probably persist with the pair there and actually a much stronger midfield considering the run of games for those players. And Isak is always a very, very easy move down into other players, apart from Watkins, who you might miss out on. But ultimately, even though Watkins has some really good fixtures for now, for the next 4 game weeks, I would say I'm probably comfortable as someone who's looking ahead, if I had the wild card, to own someone like Isak, starting with a great fixture like West Ham at home, and then owning him really up until maybe Game Week 19. So that's my thoughts in terms of this wildcard draft. That's why I've gone for this wildcard draft. As I said, if you actually have a little bit more money in the bank, you can upgrade Stewart to another budget forward option, starting from the Strand Larsens of the world all the way up into like an Evan Nilsson or Wissa. In defense, I think some people can definitely consider going for a Colwill as well, right? He's an option where ultimately, when we're considering a lot of 4.4 million defenders, he's another option to consider at 4.5, who will probably have a really good run of games, someone you don't really need to rotate over this period. In the midfield, I do think it's a little bit set in stone, but I think there's definitely room and capacity to go and consider someone like Martin Odegaard, but that will also change your defensive structure as well. So those are my thoughts right now in terms of how I would structure a draft in Game Week 12. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and do look out for more content over this international break.